My earliest memory is riding in my grandfather's boat, arm over the side, hand in the spray. I've spent much of the rest of my life chasing this feeling. All of that has led to this. The wooden boat experience.
Really? Snow already? I was mowing the lawn when this started. Now for an update on the skiff house. First, I had to get rid of the old deck. Next, I removed the siding on the studio, and then realized there's still plenty of good soil in this area, no sense in wasting it, so I got the backhoe into that narrow little spot and began to test my skills. Lastly, I pulled the siding off of the skiff house. Now to connect the two buildings with a new floor. After this floor is done, I will frame up the roof and sides, reusing the siding and battens. I will knock out the skiff house blue wall first, then decide how much of the studio wall to remove. The wood stove needs to be moved slightly, so that location determines the opening in the studio wall, as I need heat in both of those areas. These stairs I put next to the floor are only temporary. This will be a solid wall. I'll be using the French doors on the skiff house for entry. Perry, I found an even better use for this koozie. Protecting the GoPro while I'm carrying it around. Thanks. This spot in our kitchen was where the washer dryer used to be. I had an old oar I'd cut with a bandsaw. Remember that, Jim Reed? Some nice old cherry, bits of a Lyman, and a need for a permanent editing area. A week ago, I decided to fix this problem. Some stain, even on the old cubbyhole to even out wear, and then some polyurethane, sheetrock mud, fresh wall paint, a few modifications during dry fit, and it was ready to be put together. Careful, the paint may not be cured. Ended up being pretty successful, I'd say. How about you, Spec? He doesn't know. A guy named Charlie that I met while driving the Antique Boat Museum ride boat told me he had an old toy steamboat and sent me some photos. I was asked to take a look at the bow of a Lyman that a friend was working on. Some people complain about 5200, but this clear silicone caulk just stuffed down between the garboard and the keel is probably not a good thing either. A quick vacuum so I could see what I was looking at. It's really not in bad shape. I just think the garboard needs to be released and rebedded without silicone. Remember I said I visited Acorn to Arabella to do a drawing? Well, I forgot to tell you, this guy came along too. Okay, we are here at Acorn to Arabella, and you're not supposed to laugh, Steve. I am a maritime journalist from all around the world, and I am talking to Acorn to Arabella. Here is their boat, and I have my Dangar Marine shirt on, of course.
Whoa, Dangar Marine, get that off.
We will switch to Acorn to Arabella. Sorry, Stu.
That's all right, we love Stu, he's a good guy. Hope your hands are feeling better, Stu.
Acorn to Arabella.
That
All
looks
right,
a bit better.
questions. Hand tools or power tools? I think I know this one for you.
Depends what I'm doing.
But if you had to be on an island with nothing else.
Power tools, I can get it done faster.
Well, you disappoint
Funny
me,
thing is,
Steve.
I would say hand tools.
Really?
Oh yeah.
I prefer, and hand tools are more enjoyable. But
Yes.
you can do a lot more, a lot faster with beating yourself up a lot less with power tools.
That is
Not
true.
all the time, but...
But you are young, so it's too early to worry. This is important. Who do you ask for advice?
Alix usually. Definitely not Alix. I don't know. We've got a cool bunch of people that are in our pockets right now that we can pull out the phone and dial at this point.
What about in our pockets? We don't own them. There's no
No,
like,
no,
we're
no,
not,
like,
we're not
by in the pockets. I mean, like,
This is not a sponsored
this in the
episode.
pockets.
It depends on what you're doing, probably.
Yeah, but we can call Thad Danielson, Harold Burnham, Lou Sazad. Any of them are happy to chip in. Sometimes it's interesting to post on the Wooden Boat Forum and see what all of the differing opinions are. If we get real desperate, we can always ask YouTube, but that's all over the place with the responses.
And your grandfather.
Yeah, when it comes to like a flathead Chrysler, he's good job.
I know friends with flathead Chryslers. I may have to call him up. Your favorite project on the boat?
Drilling for the prop shaft was pretty interesting. That was kind of cool. Having to build like the sled to like keep that straight and in line. That was pretty fun.
I would say joining all the big timbers for the backbone and getting all those to fit.
Interesting. As you can see, we've gone deep into boating knowledge. And I won't ask you to demonstrate anything. And
That's good. We don't know how.
all right. So now, get back to work.
Don't forget, the drawing I did for Acorn to Arabella for the new t-shirt will be coming out soon, so check them out.
Okay, Mark.
All right, so this is an Adirondack guide boat that got restored over the past couple of years up here. It took a while. Unknown builder, and it was in pretty rough shape. So when I first got this, I thought it was in better shape than it was. So we ended up replacing 85% of the ribs in this boat, and the planking, we decided to cover this boat with an epoxy polyfiber combination because one of the previous owners had taken a power sander, power grinder to it, and I think he was trying to get an all-natural boat. It's always been a painted boat, but a lot of people like the varnished boat, so I think he gave up after a while. But what he did was he ground all this planking's very thin, and it laps for a smooth skin construction, and he ground everything away, so it's never going to be watertight. So short of, seeing how we'd already decided that 80% of the ribs had to be replaced, probably 90% of the planking, if not more, would have been replaced. So we decided to cover this boat with material and save the old wood inside. So this boat's been polyfiber material with epoxy on the outside only. And that was a way of preserving the old wood and keeping this boat watertight and making it usable again. This boat really wouldn't have been a restorable boat doing it any other way because it just would have been too expensive. The only real original part, the inside planking's original and the decks are original to it, but everything else had to be made. There was nothing left of this boat.
This is a good example of, again, this originally had rabbeted stems, so we had to basically took a sawzall to the stems and cut the old stems.
I'll edit out Sawzall. No.
Yeah, no, leave it in there. But the inner stem is original, okay? So with the outer stem gone, we have a termination point for the fabric covering, and then made these cherry stems, which are, faux stems, outer stems, to go on and encapsulate that termination point. It's still, to the eye, the profile that's here is what the profile was when the boat was originally built.
Andy has been working with this process since he used it to build Penn Yan Swift replicas in the 1990s. After using it to create new boats, he then began using it to save old ones that didn't have much life left in them.
Taking the point of this knife, right? So, first of all, if you ever did this with fiberglass cloth, you tear the cloth apart. So the beauty of this is I'm pulling pretty hard here with the point of my knife right across this guy. See this? And notice how it's not tearing apart.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
What is it doing?
That's all it's doing is rubbing right along the bottom of the... That's how strong
You
this
just made a
stuff
little
is.
score is all
Yeah.
you did. And you can't now tear it apart.
No. So I'm trying to show how strong.
And that is called what?
This is aircraft Dacron.
Okay.
This is what is on here. All right? And I believe this
Yeah, it's
one-
like a sail.
Well, yeah. Except there's a big difference. You can't heat shrink a sail.
Okay.
This heat shrinks, like I was telling you the other night. Okay. So here's a fiber. Right there. There's one fiber. So if you apply heat from a iron, like you'd iron your clothes with, this fiber will just accordion. It'll develop an accordion shape. Okay? So that does,
And that becomes its new memory?
yeah. And so that does two things. All right? One, it allows this flat sheet to shrink to the shape of this hull. Okay? Which is kind of cool. But the other thing that it does, if you can imagine this thread, which is straight right now, and so when I pull on it, I can't stretch it at all. But if this thread were an accordion shape and I went to pull on it, it's like pulling on a spring. Okay, so it not only does it shrink, it gives it flexibility. Right now, this thing has no flexibility at all.
Does the... Oh, so it becomes... When it shrinks, it becomes more flexible, which
Yeah.
is a strange way of
Yeah.
thinking of something.
Yeah.
It's opposite of what you would expect to happen.
So what you got to do is kind of get your head into how a wooden airplane wing would work that's covered in fabric. And basically, as you know, if you ever flew on a jetliner and you see the wings moving, you want those wings to flex. Everything
Right.
is about controlled flexing, okay? This just ties into that whole concept. So, you know, this is stuff that couple reasons we started using this years ago.
And this is what you used when you made the Swifts, right?
Right, and then the reason that we went there was, and anybody who's worked on an old Swift that's, 60 years old knows that they usually have issues with the canvas covering. Okay? Now there's two things happening with a Swift that you don't have to worry about with a guide boat. But the biggest thing is the Swift gets up on plane. Alright? So they had to actually glue some of that canvas to the hull because the suction created by planing the boat off would suck the canvas away from the hull and the boat would nosedive into the water. Sometimes if the canvas is old, it would even tear the canvas. So the beauty of doing this particular thing where you're using this Dacron, which the only thing that'll break this down is ultraviolet rays. Okay, it will not ever get mildewed, it won't rot. You can leave it out in the muck for 20 years.
Is it nylon?
It's Dacron.
So Dacron is it's its own thing.
It's its
not
own thing, exactly. And it was developed by one of those chemical companies, and it was Dow or whoever.
Sounds
back
like a
after the
Dow
war.
name.
Yeah. So, the big thing with this is keep it covered with a finish. Preferably an opaque finish.
So the one thing that you were telling me about is that the shape of the hull is very important. Like
It
you
is.
can't put this across a lap strake because it'll just bridge the gaps rather than fall into them.
Right. I mean, if you can imagine, we're shrinking this, we're tautening it with heat, so it sort of like ends up like this drumhead effect, right? But if you want to show the bow of the boat here, you'll see this to your eye looks like
There is a sweep there.
there's a concavity to it, right? But this is probably about as much of a hollow as you would dare do. But this guy will tauten right down
Now,
and cover.
let's go through the whole process as far as you've got a hull. This hull is just wood. It's bare wood.
Yeah, okay, it's bare wood. One thing you want to do is you want to ferre the hull out, as well as you can get it ferred out. You want to fill all the fastener holes. You want that hull that you're going to cover this with to be as close to perfect as you're good with, okay?
Like if you were going to paint it rather than doing this.
Yeah,
you'd-
exactly. Now the other thing, and we're talking about using this with an epoxy process as opposed to this with a dope process, which is slightly different. So I'll just talk about the epoxy process because that's what we're looking at. So basically, you would prime all the wood with epoxy, okay? And the idea is that what you want is when you start filling this thing with epoxy, you want it to land on a surface that's already primed so you don't get dry spots and not dry spots. All right, so your first coat is epoxy and ferred out. All right, so now the wood is all hardened up. In this case, the wood is pine, okay? But if it were cedar, like on the trout boat, it's even more important because the cedar is soft and the epoxy will stiffen that wood up.
Okay.
Sand it all off, get it ready to go, then basically you're laying your sheet of fabric across from gunnel to gunnel, okay? And there is a product that you use to tape, basically it tacks this edge of the fabric along the gunnel line. So it's
Mechanically
it's
or
a glue.
adhesive?
It's adhesive, and
Okay.
it's called polyfiber is what we mostly use. So you basically paint that on 3/4 of an inch wide to an inch wide, depending. And that, when you heat, basically you can work this right into the glue. And then, because of the end of the boat, you're going to have to cut it with a knife, right, and split it on the ends because it's going to wrap.
So 1 second before
Yep,
you've coated this with epoxy, the epoxy cured,
it's cured.
and then you're putting this onto that cured,
Yep.
which is basically a primer. It's an epoxy primer.
It
It's
is
not
a
a
primer.
not a super thick thing.
No.
And then, okay, just because it started to sound in my head like it was wet when you were putting this on, and I
No.
didn't think it was. Okay,
Nope. So, but it is sanded.
okay.
You're not. Just
It's
putting
not just the raw epoxy, and then
right.
you sanded it down
You're
again.
going to create a mechanical bond. When
Okay.
You get this on.
And it's important that you have places to trap the
Yeah.
tape or the adhesive, whatever you want to call, where this fabric edge is. It
Well-
would be really, it'd be difficult to just do it on the water line in this case and make it,
Yeah.
you'd have to do some work to the wood to do that, correct?
You would. You
Like a
would.
West System bottom, they have that, it only goes up to the bottom paint usually.
Right.
So I don't, they're sanding it in. I don't know if they're rabbiting out a little
Yeah,
bit
you
or
do-
what
you
they're.
do a little bit of a rabbit with you could grind it in or plane it in or however you.
And they're just
choose to do it.
stopping it right there. Okay.
Right. So what we're doing here is we're going to go gunnel to gunnel, okay, and tack it off. And so once this is tacked all the way down the boat, and like I said, where this comes out like this, if you can picture this coming on each side, so it gets split, probably back to somewhere in here, depends. You want to be able to lap it, so it's actually, you can't see it, but it's actually lapped up here. And it's lapped all the way down around the stem, and of course the outer stem helps protect that. So once that's all done, you have an iron, and you would calibrate the iron, all right, to basically, I don't know, what is your mark? Is it 350 we wound up doing a final? Yeah.
I have to look it up.
Is the iron actually touching?
Yeah?
Yes.
So you couldn't use like electric heat gun?
No, and the reason for that is it's kind of temperature specific. And people who've worked on airplane wings will immediately jump on this and say, well, God, it's a whole lot touchier. If you're covering dead air between two pieces of wood, like you would with a fabric wing, all right, the heat's even more critical because
Right.
this wooden hull acts as a big heat sink.
It's making it fairly even.
Yeah, exactly. And it's drawing that heat away. Where if you're just stretching this over a wooden frame, you don't have that. So this will shrink a lot faster over airspace than it will over this hull. But
And you're just being fairly consistent and you're moving the iron, or you're doing a spot and it's done once you've done that spot.
no, it's not.
Oh,
That's
okay.
the thing. You're gonna work your way out around this boat several times. And sometimes
A day-long process to put.
well, it depends on the shape of the hull, depends on how many you've done. If you wait 20 years before you do another one, it can take longer. I'll
Okay.
tell ya. But the other thing about the polyfiber is if you need, you may find as you draw this thing down, you've got an area where it's like, boy, that just needs to come down a little bit more. You can take the iron and reheat that polyfiber and pull that thing down, tauten it, and then that polyfiber will reattach itself.
So you don't have a bunch of little spring clamps along here holding it. It's strong enough that it's holding on its own.
It's holding on its own, and what that thing does is it gives a continuous fastener point, right?
Yeah.
Like if you were to tack it, let's say, that you would
It's
do it-
only strong at the tacks.
yeah, and you would see that kind of telegraphed up into your fabric. So the beauty of this is it's a continuous line.
Okay. Okay, so we've now got this fiber. It's over the whole thing.
Right.
but you're not quite done yet. You're going over it and you're getting all the details. How much of you can't pull out a wrinkle? Does it shrink that much that you could actually pull a wrinkle out?
I mean, if it's an enormous wrinkle, okay, if it's several inches, it's not going to pull that out. But
something that's sticking up 1/8 of an inch, it's going to pull that out. So it's shrinking quite a bit.
You're going to find, and that's the thing, it's hard to explain. It would be different if you were holding a camera and we were physically doing it so people could see. But you'll get a feel for it as you go, as to what it can do and what it can't do. But that's why I'm saying, like, you don't want to, let's say it's all on here. You don't want to just shrink the heck of it out of it up on this end without moving down the boat.
And seeing what's happening.
Right, you want to shrink the whole thing. You want to work around the whole boat, okay? And dialing it in as you go until when you're done, the whole thing is on here and it's taut, and you're like, wow, that's tight, you know? Then my suggestion is let it sit a bit. And you may find you need to come back and you need to hit a few more spots and just kind of keep dialing it in. Now we're assuming that we've got it on here and it's taut and we're happy.
Okay.
Right? Okay. Before you start doing the epoxy work, or even the dope, it doesn't matter.
What would be the advantage or disadvantage of epoxy or dope?
Well, the epoxy is going to be a little bit stronger than the dope. Okay, so
which is going to be easier to work with.
Well, that's debatable.
Are they both a mixture, 2-part mixtures?
No, the dope is
one part.
Yep.
Does the dope just air? Well, air dry might be the wrong thing. It might be a chemical thing,
but no, it air dries.
Okay.
And, it's a soft plastic, basically, and you can paint over it eventually, and all the rest.
More flexible, the dope?
Yeah, it is more flexible. The epoxy is pretty darn flexible. We always used West System epoxy because at the time, when I was first doing this, it was mostly West System epoxy.
There probably wasn't anybody, unless you were a big commercial guy.
Systems 3 was around, but like mass epoxy hadn't come out yet. And I remember I talked to the fella at West and I explained what we were trying to do, and he said, well, I recommend using the slow hardener, the 206, as opposed to the 205. So I've always used the 206 hardener. Now, that being said, I think I was telling you the other night, I set up a test with this over a couple pieces of wood and flexed the daylights out of it. Okay,
yeah, you
after
did
it was
tell me
epoxy.
that.
Yeah. So, if it was flexing this bad, your boat would be coming apart. You'd have
Right.
other things to worry about. And this, with the epoxy through the fabric, didn't break, the epoxy
It didn't come
stayed
loose of the
flexible.
wood.
Right. The whole
So
thing.
how hard is it to wet this?
Okay.
Similar to cloth, or
No, it's harder.
it's harder?
It's harder
because
than cloth.
it looks pretty dense.
It's a tight weave, okay? Those photos that I sent you, you may want to...
I'll put those in here.
utilize those, because they'll show. But basically, to go back to our boat, all right? So now we're happy it's on here. So there's sizing in here that they use when they weave this. The sizing is a chemical lubricant that allows the thread to slide past itself in the weaving process. We want to get that out because it could work against what we're trying to do, okay? So, recommend that when you're done with this, basically kind of wash it down with acetone, and the acetone will remove the sizing, all right? And sometimes, I'm going to say most of the time, you wash it down with the acetone, it's going to relax this just a little bit. And you're going to see, if you pull your hand down it, yep, that's a little bit loose. Fire up your iron and go back over it very carefully and give it one last good taut with that sizing rod. Okay, one last good shrink. Once that's done, then you can start epoxying. And basically, we use like a plastic spreader like you'd use for Bondo.
A Bondo spreader.
Yeah, and you don't want to work too far ahead. And the other thing, because like I said, I'm used to working with West, there's probably other epoxies that would be even better. But keep the epoxy relatively warm, because when the epoxy's warm, of course, it spreads easier, it's not as thick, and you're trying to work it through this weave. Now,
Are you able to work this whole boat in one setting?
yep.
Are you working? Do you have to be careful to keep wet and wet, or is it not? You're not kicking that quickly.
You're not kicking that quickly.
Okay, so it's still the front or back, wherever you started, is still wet when you finish at the other end, and then the next day is when you're going to be where it's actually kicked over.
Well, I'll get into that in a second.
Okay.
But basically, you know, one thing I wanted to say, difference between this or any other Dacron fabric as opposed to, say, fiberglass, is anybody who's worked with polyester and fiberglass knows the polyester works itself into the glass fibers. Okay, it becomes part of it. All right, this doesn't. And I guess the best analogy I could use, if you've ever done any concrete work and you're going to put a pad down in a garage, when you make that pour, you usually put some wire mesh into the concrete to keep that concrete from cracking, right? So the concrete doesn't go into the wire mesh, it goes around the wire mesh and it encapsulates it. And it's all part of a unit when you're all done. That's exactly what happens here. Okay, the epoxy goes around the weave in the Dacron, doesn't go into the weave per se. All right, and when you're all done, this fabric sits in here just like the mesh in your concrete floor in your garage, and it strengthens this epoxy. This is what gives
I
it
could
its
see
strength.
why you couldn't. You have to first put the epoxy down on this, because you'd be hard pressed to push enough through there to get a nice even thing underneath.
That's right, and it's all about getting it even. So you're working, you know, basically I would scoop it out sometimes, or even dump a little bit down and then work it in with my spreader as I go, and just keep working. Just keep going until you've got the whole thing filled.
What does it look like when you finish? Is it still white as that?
No, it's translucent.
Because I thought I saw pictures of you doing a transom, and I'm like, did he actually go over the whole transom, and could it still be wood? Because the Swifts had a wood-colored transom, didn't they?
They didn't. No, fabric went on the transom. Has a motor plate, which was varnished oak, but the transom itself was always fabric.
But does it look like wood when the fabric's over there, or not? It's translucent,
you
but
can see the wood.
you can see the wood, but not pretty like varnish.
No.
Okay.
I mean, don't use it over. If you're going to do this thing clear, don't do this.
If you wanted to have, let's say you had a square stern, you would just do the, what'd you call it, fiber? What was the tape or the adhesive that goes on the edge?
Yeah, use the
You could just do that right on.
glue around the perimeter of the transom, and you would glue this thing straight on the
And
transom.
you'd probably put a chrome or brass strip or something
Well,
to.
actually, the Swift, we used to use what they call pinked tape, which I don't know if we have any of that around. It's, you know, what pinking shears are, right? They have a little crazy. Well, when you do the end of a wing on an airplane, where this stuff comes out at the end of a wing, and it gets joined the same way we joined that there.
Okay.
All right. Then you would put some tape over it, and the tape literally reinforces. Yeah, here we go. So this is what they call pinked tape, and this is the same material.
Okay.
This is heat shrinkable. The other thing is, if you look really close, you see that weave runs back and forth at a 45-degree angle.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the cool thing about that is when I pull it, it actually can pull. I can pull this right now. And see what it does when I pull? It sort of goes at an angle. It wants to go around a corner when I pull it. That's what you go around your transom with. And you lay that in there, and you glue that on, and then you epoxy this into place. So it's an extra reinforcement if you're doing a transom, that you're not going to use some kind of a wooden or metal
Edge on it.
reinforcement on it. Okay, so that's how we did the Swifts, and we did that at the transom. And you know, in 20 plus years, never had heard of anything being an issue. But nobody's ever come back to me and said, you know, this process failed. It's no good. In fact, one of them, actually, the guy kind of ignored it. It filled up with rainwater and started bouncing around, and it sunk. And they didn't get it for a couple of days. And basically it wore a hole in one area of the boat. where it
Rubbing
sat
on the bottom.
right? The rest of the material intact perfectly, and they were able to just do a patch on a thing and fix the hole in the boat and fix the rest of it. So if you were to go back to this, you know, we've spread out our epoxy, okay? There's a period of time where the epoxy starts to get hard, but it's not fully cured. All right, so like if you put your finger on it, your finger doesn't stick to it, but it's you couldn't sand it. It's
Right.
still.
You can leave a mark sometimes
what they
when
call green.
when you do something to it at that point too.
Right. Well, the other thing you can do is roll another coat right over it
Oh,
without
okay.
sanding. Okay, so if you wanted to put 6 coats on here, you could just set up and start rolling coats.
So how many coats of epoxy do you have on this one?
What do we got? Probably, well, that fill coat, and then you're going to do what I would do at that point is a fair coat, which we would, yeah.
There's 2 before the qual.
right. So your
Are they both put on at the same consistency, or is the fairing coat thickened?
fairing coat is thickened,
Okay.
and that's a microlite. It's
Uh-huh.
another West product, right? So, you know, I know when we were doing it, I used to use somewhere between mayonnaise, pretty close to mayonnaise consistency. So in other words, easy to spread quickly, all right? Not going to run off the boat,
Okay.
all right? And then you want to get it on there when you're fairing the fabric, because you've already done all your underneath work. You're basically just running down this thing and doing a fairly skim coat on it. All right, but it fills it up enough that when it cures, you can buzz back down it and sand that. All right, get it sanded to where it's pretty good, and then we do use gray pigment, another West product. You pigmentize the epoxy. All right?
So you know where the layer. Do you know when you sanded through?
Yeah, there's that, but it's also a UV protector.
Okay.
All right, so it's just another step. It's also a little easier to sand once the pigment is in the epoxy. So
What are you sanding with? Orbital?
yeah, just use an orbital.
You probably also want to make sure that you have enough epoxy so you don't go through the epoxy and affect the fabric too, right?
Right, now if you do, and it can happen, what it'll do is it'll fuzz up. Okay, it's not like fiberglass, you could just sand through the fiberglass.
Right.
You can't sand through this unless you're really trying. So that you'll see it, it'll fuzz up in a little spot. Next time you go over with the epoxy, that epoxy will fill those little fibers and you can just work right over it. So what I was going to say, you know, we just finished our fairing coat. Our fairing coat now, we've sanded our fairing coat. Now we're doing the pigmented epoxy coats, of which you would do 3 or 4 depending. Okay,
Now, are these adding strength, or are you just trying to make it look good?
they're adding depth, and it helps it to look good too.
Okay.
But what you want to do is get enough depth that, you know, you're protecting the fabric. All right, so if you do, I forget what the mill thickness is on a coat of epoxy. It's not very much.
I don't know.
But so you've got your mechanical. You've sanded, so it's going to be a mechanical bond on this next one. You roll a coat on, tip it off, wait, and when it gets to that green stage, like I was describing, you roll and tip another coat, wait, same thing, roll and tip another coat. So there's your 3 coats. And if you think you want to, you know, depending on the boat, you could do 4. We mostly always did 3.
How tight is the window on that green stage? I mean,
Depends on the heat. You know, depends on the weather.
if it's not that, I almost call it rubbery when it's like that. It has sort of a rubbery consistency.
Mm-hmm.
If you get beyond that, are you going to have a problem?
If you get beyond that, just let it cure.
Okay.
Just let
But
it
I mean,
cure.
what if you were halfway through and all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is, you just stop.
It's not likely.
It's not that
No,
quick.
It's not like a light switch, you know.
All right.
So, but I'm just saying, let's say, you know, your wife's like, hey, we're supposed to go out to dinner. You know, you don't cancel dinner. You just say, okay, well, I'll just come back tomorrow and I'll just scuff this thing off, you know, and deblush it.
In my house, we canceled dinner.
Nice. Okay. I used to do that too. But.
I'll be editing that out.
So, you know, that's it. You basically roll your 3 coats on and let it cure really well, deblush it, and then, you know, basically sand it down to a nice consistency that's ready for paint. And then whatever you choose to paint.
And then when are you also priming with paint primer?
On
Or-
this guy,
I think we
I
did.
think we did. Yeah.
I think we did a quarter pounder.
Right. In fact, if you're going to use
So there's quite a bit of, I mean, it has the look like there's a lot of paint or something here, but smooth. You know what I mean? You can tell there's some depth there
Yeah.
when you look at it.
Yep.
It doesn't look like it's been just quickly finished.
Right.
But man, it's glossy, so you can see, if you really want to look, you can see that it's not perfectly flat, but it's not a piece of plastic.
I mean, that's the thing.
Oh,
You
it was
know,
in rough shape. It was in rough shape.
you could spend the rest of your life and you could make it into a piece of plastic, but
This is a smoother surface than my fiberglass boat,
right.
than my fiberglass skiff. I mean, this,
And
even after I faired it, it's not this smooth.
well, and like Mark said, remember, I mean, you saw the inside of this.
Yeah.
The outside was every bit as bad. Okay, so there was a lot of work getting this particular hull to being like here.
So-
it's not like the Swift, which was a brand new hull.
Right.
Pretty easy, So there's work to this, but at the same time, this boat, you don't have to keep it in a boathouse out of the sun. There's things you can do with this boat that you can't do really to a traditional guide boat.
Well, the other thing we should have said earlier, we might have to jump back or something, but you're talking about repairing and restoring a boat that probably wasn't a candidate without replacing everything, so you're actually, because, and I'm always thinking about this all the time. How far do we go with composites? How far, it's always nice to use the new things. It's nice to keep the original way people did things, but we also have to think about the people that are ending up with some of these boats from us. They don't care about all that stuff. They want to get in the boat and they want to use it. And if it's hard for them to deal with, it's going to end up in a hedgerow a lot quicker than if it's easy for them to deal with.
The more I learn about wooden boats, the harder I find it to be staunchly traditional. I want these boats to survive, but I also want people to use them. There seems to be no easy answers. This has been the Wooden Boat Experience on the Glass Goat channel. I'm Scott.ouderkirk. Thanks for joining me.